All right, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Kyle Taysom is the CEO at Dairyland Laboratories, where he leads the company's mission for creating value and quantifying variation in ag inputs. Kyle has his bachelor's in dairy science from UW River Falls, an MBA from Minnesota School of Business, and is currently finishing a master's degree in data science through Wisconsin La Crosse. His professional experience includes time as a dairy nutrition consultant and part of the team that develops several on-farm applications of NIR, including John Deere's Harvest Lab. Since he started as Dairyland's business development manager in 2011, Dairyland has grown to include 6 labs here in the US and expanded their business to include some web-based NIR support services that currently enable NIR feed analysis at more than 30 labs, research institutes, feed mills, and farms throughout the world. It's a pleasure to have you today, Kyle, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Ben. We're okay with the screen and the sound, right?
Yeah.
All right. As Ben said, after I finished my bachelor's degree, I spent a little bit of time trying to sell feed to dairy farms. You could make a legitimate argument that I wasn't that good at it. I'd probably still be doing it. But for the last 8 years, I've been here at Dairyland Labs, which is my family business. During that time, it's given me a different perspective on kind of how we make this soup, how we test feeds, and how we generate those formulation inputs. I've also been wrapping up a data science degree here, which has given me, again, a different perspective on some of those old problems about how data flows and how we manage variation. So we're going to try to cover some of that ground today. I think we can trace a lot of our current feed infrastructure and formulation programs back to the mid-90s. The big IT breakthrough at that time was the invention of the Lotus 1-2-3 spreadsheet. This allowed fairly complex diet formulation. In the early 90s, CNCPS version 1 came out. Late 90s, early 2000s, ORDC and NRC 2001 equations came out. Basically, at that time, we started down this path or this behavior pattern where we'd go out to a farm and take a sample. We'd ship it to a lab. Lab sends the report to the nutritionist. Nutritionist plugs it in the formulation program. And they send the diet back out to the farm. In the 90s, that whole process maybe took 2 weeks. And maybe that was okay when we were feeding 50 cows out of a couple silos. If we jump ahead to 2008, this is about the time I was finishing my bachelor's degree and when I was getting trained on how to balance diets and sell feed to dairy farms. I was trained in the same behavior pattern. We go out to the farm, take a sample of the feeds they have, send it to the lab, get a report back, formulate a diet, and send it back to the farm. Again, maybe that was okay at the time. Farm side was getting a little larger. That process got a little faster because we were able to send reports by email and labs improved their turnaround time. But I think we can do quite a bit better given today's technology and the scale of farms today. So where are we going? This is a picture from a farm that we work with overseas. You can see they have 7 TMR mixers there, feeding thousands of cows, feeding semi-loads of feed every day. They have an entirely different set of problems trying to manage variation in feeds. We are already in the age of the Internet of Things, but I mean the technology exists that if we wanted to as an industry, we could set it up that our mixer scales, our lab data, and our formulation software would all communicate with each other seamlessly and in real time. That technology exists today if we chose to implement it as an industry. Couple questions I want to ask. One, is there any sign that farm size is plateauing? I'm not saying large dairies are the solution to all the world's problems. I think we also need to recognize most cows don't live on 50 cow dairies anymore. We need to manage feed variation in a different way. Second question, is there a limit to how many input parameters formulation models are going to want? Just in the time that I've been at Dairyland Labs, we've added probably 25 parameters to the corn silage reports. We're going to go through a report here a little bit later that has over 100 parameters on it. That's not unusual. That's the most common package customers order. But these two ideas seem to be a little bit at odds. We're feeding more and more tons of feed every day, but we're trying to get more and more intricate specs on those formulation inputs. So how can we design a system that makes sense with the scale of farms today and with the technology we have available? I think there's three big obstacles we have to overcome to create a better system. And the first is getting realistic sampling strategies. This is a giant corn silage pile, I think out in South Dakota. I believe there's 200,000 tons of silage there. This poor little guy down in the bottom right corner in the shadow there is supposed to walk up to that pile and take a 1 pound sample to ship to the lab. At the lab, we're going to dry and grind that. We're actually going to end up testing about 10 grams. And then as a nutrition consultant, you're supposed to formulate a diet that describes how that silage is going to feed based on a 10-gram sample. You know, at some level, that seems a little bit ridiculous. I got one slide here just talking about how much variation is actually within these piles. So if you went up to the same pile over and over, what kind of variation would you see in the samples? So Ohio State data here comes from a study they did in 2012. Excuse me, they went to 8 farms and they sampled each feed every day for 14 consecutive days. The Dairyland data here comes from customer identified lots. So we have a system that lets customers identify feeds within farms and then track how they change over time. All these values are average standard deviations within those lots. So it says, again, if you went to that same pile over and over and took consecutive samples, what kind of variation would you see? I've spent way too much time in school. I'm kind of comfortable with standard deviations. They're fun mathematically, but I understand sometimes they're a little bit hard to think about. This graph here is trying to illustrate what kind of variation we should expect in individual samples if the stats from that previous page are correct. So if we went to a corn silage bunker and took 100 samples, just one after another, this is the kind of variation we'd expect to see in those individual samples. Now, this isn't illustrating sampling error. This isn't illustrating lab error. This is just realistically what kind of scatter you'd expect to see. An analogy I like to use here is shooting a BB gun versus a shotgun. I've got a 7-year-old son. We like plinking around in the backyard with a BB gun. The consequences are low. If we put one BB in the air and hits the target, great. If we miss, no big deal. But if we need to get serious and the consequences are real, we're going to use a shotgun and we're going to put more BBs in the air to try to hit our target. Another way to think about this, if we formulated 100 diets using just individual samples, 30 of those diets are going to use starch values that are wrong by more than 3 points, and 5 of those diets are going to use starch values that are wrong by more than 6 points. Again, that's not because anybody made an error, that's just the kind of noise we have in sampling data. So if individual samples aren't good enough, that brings us to obstacle number 2, that we need better data handling systems. We need to get away from these individual sample PDF reports. To me, these are artifacts of the 80s and 90s where the best way to get data from point A to point B was to print it and send it in the mail. All right, we're in the internet, or the age of the Internet of Things. We can do a lot better than this. The third big obstacle I see is we're just trying to focus on way too many parameters at one time. This is a typical submission form for feed samples at our lab. I would have a very hard time finding any individual customer that could walk through all of these packages and explain what they mean and how to use them in the context of a diet. Same thing, we're going to look at this forage report later that has over 100 parameters. It would be difficult to even find many college professors that could walk line by line through that report, tell you how the things are measured and what they really mean. We have to find a way to simplify our analysis if we're going to make better decisions. So step 1, making a systematic sampling strategy. In the background here, I have that large farm again, but everything I'm going to describe on this slide is true whether you're feeding 10 cows or 1,000 cows. The big question I think we need to wrestle with is how many samples we actually need in order to make decisions about feeds or formulate diets. So the graph here is showing the accuracy of our average. We take multiple samples and average them together versus the number of samples. So again, using that corn silage starch data with an individual sample here, we start out with an error of 3. If we want to cut that error in half, we have to move up to 4 samples. If we want to cut it in half again, we have to move up to 16. And then the returns are pretty diminishing after that. We'd have to go to 64 and 256 to keep cutting that error in half. So there's a lot to be gained by moving from one to multiple samples. There's no reason to be going to thousands of samples. Feeds don't actually vary that much, but we need to get away from this individual sample diet formulation. To me, I would like to see 2 to 4 samples before any decision was made, whether that's a formulation or purchasing feeds. If it's worth testing, I think it's worth testing multiple times. I got one slide here just to illustrate whether cost is actually a limitation in taking enough samples. So the curves here show our cost per head per day and how that varies depending on our herd size. On the left, we have single samples. On the right, we have duplicates. And then we have weekly, biweekly, and monthly sampling. Just want to point out a couple points on here. If we think about that herd in the early 90s, milking less than 100 cows, sampling their forage once a month, they were spending about 2 cents per head per day on forage testing. If we're feeding 1,000 cows, right, we can go to duplicate samples every week and still be spending half as much as that dairy was in the early 90s. I'm not saying that we need to be doing duplicate samples every week. I'm just saying I don't think cost is really the limitation on why most people don't take enough samples. I want to run through one scenario here to try to illustrate why I think duplicate sampling is warranted in some cases. This is going to be a corn silage bunker that we sampled in duplicate over 6 months. The first time through, I'm going to show the decisions we'd make when we have a single sample, and the second time what would happen if we did duplicates. So our first sample comes back from the lab, 30% NDF, about 70% moisture. Next one has a little bit of noise. Third sample, we've got an NDF now is up to 38. Moisture is up above 70, but I don't know, is that noise or is that a real change? We'll wait and see what happens with the next sample. All right, so again, a little higher in fiber. Maybe now we have enough information to justify a diet change. If we go ahead a few samples, now we've got another high NDF, high moisture sample. Should I make a diet change or not? This time we're going to hedge and say, sure, we'll make a diet change. If we keep going through here, we'll find examples where we're going to respond to noise in the data. And over 6 months, maybe we make 4 diet changes here. Now I'm going to go back through and add in the duplicates from each of those testing periods. Here, by the time we get to that June 1st testing period, we've got 2 samples that both show the feed's now higher in NDF and higher in moisture. Now we have enough confidence to go ahead and implement that diet change a full 2 weeks earlier than we would have when we had single samples. But if we look at the duplicates across the rest of the 6 months, they reveal that those other changes were just chasing noise in our data. So if we were to implement duplicate sampling, we could have made the right formulation change 2 weeks earlier. We could have avoided 3 unnecessary formulation changes. So we've implemented a systematic sampling strategy, but now I've got 30 PDFs on my desk. They all have more than 100 parameters on each one of them. How can I possibly formulate a diet or make a decision from those? Well, we're going to go through a report here. We're going to start out with 103 parameters. I'm going to get it down to 11 that we actually should care about, and we're going to get through that in 10 minutes. It's going to require us to make a couple of agreements here. The first agreement we have to make is that decisions between feed types do not require feed tests. We know that alfalfa is different than corn silage. We don't need to send a sample to the lab to figure that out. We know corn silage is different than grass. We know distillers is different than gluten feed. We don't need to be testing for those purposes. The second is, just because formulation software requires an input doesn't mean we need to look at it and think about it. All right, we can pass input parameters in the background. The computers at the lab can talk to your computer that has the formulation software, and we can pass a lot of those parameters without spending a lot of time getting lost in the minutia of it. All right, so here's our forage report. The first 29, I didn't even print it because they wouldn't fit on the page. UNDF is a percent of NDF, DNDF is a percent of dry matter. I didn't put on the page. There's plenty other expressions of fiber digestibility here. I did not include all the time points we actually measured at the lab, and I didn't put in any micro minerals. So that gets us down to 74. We can kill another 29 parameters if we agree that they only have to be expressed in one unit. By that I mean we don't need both moisture and dry matter. They tell us the same thing. We don't need all of our protein fractions as dry matter and as a percent of crude protein and as a percent of soluble protein. We don't need lignin two ways, and we don't need our fatty acids both ways. That brings us down to the energy table you see at the bottom there. We have TDN, NEL, NEG, NEM, milk per ton and beef per ton. We've got 5 different energy systems. I understand that diets are formulated oftentimes on NEL and NEG, but all of those energy values are derived from TDN. They can't move independent of TDN. So if we're just trying to understand how our feeds are changing, I think we can just focus on TDN if we want to deal with energies. That gets us down to 45. We can kill another 10 parameters here if we agree we're only going to use one formulation system. By that I mean we're not going to try to use NRC and CNCPS at the same time. We're not going to try to use CNCPS version 1 and version 6.5 at the same time. So we can just use the inputs that matter for our formulation program. That would allow us to get down to 1 measurement of fiber. We would not need both lignin and U240. Your formulation program can only use one of those at a time. We don't need 2 sugars. We don't need 2 fats. We also don't need 5 energy systems. You can only balance on 1 TDN at a time. We don't need to look at it 5 ways in every report. All right, we're going to have to kill some sacred cows to get down below 35. Just want to remind us about agreement number 1 that we don't need lab tests to make decisions between feed types. I'm going to make the argument that the purpose of multiple NDFD time points is to describe differences across feed types, not within feed types. So the graph here shows NDFD. Here we measured at 12, 30, and 72 hours. These are averages of thousands of samples. We see alfalfa and corn silage here in the gray, some other traded feeds in the other colors. Anytime these lines intersect, there's some justification for having multiple time points because feeds that look different at different time points. A good example here is if we focus in on soy hulls and beet pulp. So soy hulls is in yellow, beet pulp's in pink. At any time point past 30 hours, those look very similar. They both look very digestible. But if we come back to that 12-hour time point, beet pulp has an NDFD of 75% at 12 hours, where soy hulls is still in the low 40s. Those are completely different feeds, and without multiple time points, it's hard to describe those 2 models in a way to differentiate them. That doesn't mean we need multiple time points to think about individual feeds. So this is a pretty similar setup using all of the samples from last year's forage Super Bowl. We've got alfalfa on the left, corn silage on the right, and looking at NDFDs. The point I'm trying to make here is these lines across all the individual alfalfa samples rarely cross in any meaningful way. If I know the highest sample at 30 hours, then I know the highest sample at all the other time points beyond it. The corn silage samples here look much different than the alfalfa. They digest slower, but the digestion continues much longer. But again, those lines rarely intersect in any meaningful way. If we know the best sample at 30 hours, we know the best sample at all the other time points as well. So I'm trying to make this argument that these multiple time points, while they're probably important and useful for modeling, we can just pass them through in the background if we've already decided what type of feed we're feeding. That lets us get rid of 6 more parameters on this report. All right, there's been a lot of talk today about fatty acids. I am all in that balancing for fatty acids is important. I don't think that means we need to be printing individual fatty acids on forage reports or looking at them unless we're trying to make decisions between feed types. This graph shows total fat on the x-axis, 18.2 on the y-axis, and it shows a bunch of different corn products. You've got corn stalks, corn distillers, corn grain, corn silage. And you'll notice as long as we know the concentration of the total fat, then we know how much 18.2 we have in those feeds. We don't need to print all the individual fatty acids on the reports to know that. So that would let us free up 5 more lines here. Just 1 minute on potassium and decad variation in forages. Here we have on the X all the different minerals we might put into a decad calculation, and all agree that when we're formulating diets and adding other supplements, those are all important. But if we're just trying to manage decad variation in our forages, all we really need to know is this value way over here on the left, which is the potassium. The variation in potassium in the forages dominates all of the other minerals when it comes to decad contribution. So we can hide those minerals and pass them through in the background. All right, we're down to 20. I said we could get to 11. What else can we prune here? If we have lactic acid, I don't think we need pH or vice versa. They're both going to be highly correlated to each other in forages or in silages. I don't think we need to look at NDICP. Yes, it's an input for NRC formulation. Yes, there's another NDICP. It's an input for C and CPS. But it's a situation where just because our models use them doesn't mean we have to look at them. I don't know anybody that's ever been able to make a decision by looking at an NDICP value. If we're doing these by NIR, I don't think we need to bother with acetic and propionic acid. The ability of NIR to measure those is pretty poor. Our signal to noise ratio in those is pretty poor. UNDF has gotten pretty popular, probably has some useful applications in the context of a full diet, thinking about rumen fill. But to me, NDF tells us how much fiber we have. NDFD tells us how digestible it is. UNDF in that respect is redundant. Sugar, I'm not sure we need to spend a lot of time looking at in silages. It's going to be pretty low. Again, our measurement methods there are fairly crude. Signal to noise ratio isn't great. Total fat, yes, balancing fatty acids is important, but I don't think we can look at a corn silage fat value and make many decisions. We can go ahead and let that pass through in the background. Just 2 minutes quick on starch digestibility by NIR. I think it's well known that the primary driver of starch digestibility is particle size. Those large particles are going to digest much slower than that corn powder. But in every lab that I've ever been to, we scan samples after they're ground through a 1 millimeter screen. So before we show the sample to the NIR instrument, we've taken out all of the variability in the most important aspect of starch digestibility. On the right here, we have a modern instrument where if we wanted to, we could scan samples without grinding them. But if you think about that instrument scanning from the bottom up, if you put large particles and small particles in the same container and scan from the bottom, you're only going to see the fine particles at the bottom. So what you end up with when you try to do NIR calibrations for starch digestibility is this really tight relationship to ammonia and soluble protein. The only thing the NIR can see is that protein matrix and how broken down it is. So this information ends up being almost completely redundant. Most people aren't going to like this, but if it was up to me, I would just look at soluble protein on corn grain and corn silage. The information again is redundant with starch digestibility and ammonia. If soluble protein's high, the other two are going to be high. If it's low, the other two are going to be low. So that gets us down to our 11. I think we're probably running up against the time here. I just want to jump out quick though. All right, if we only need to see and think about a handful of nutrients, then let's build and use data handling tools that make that easy. I'm going to show an example of a tool that our customers use for monitoring samples over time. I'm not saying this is the gold standard or the way you should do it in the future, but I think it's a pretty good band-aid to get from where we've been to where we need to be. Here we're going to let you quickly visualize your key nutrients. You see how multiple samples are changing over time. You can see maybe protein here is a little bit lower recently. We can also quickly identify outlier samples. We might say we don't believe this starch value here. You can click on it to throw it out. If we look at our pH and NDFDs here, you might say the last 3 samples look like they're a little different. So if I wanted to create a formulation here, I'll pick 3 samples. With a few clicks, I can get to a reliable formulation spec without sifting through 30 PDFs with 100 different parameters on them. Here we can download an XML file that'll load right into those formulation programs. So to wrap up, uncertainty and confusion don't need to be inputs for feed decisions. We can create systematic sampling strategies. We can focus in on a handful of key parameters that actually drive our decisions. And we can create and use tools that make good decision making easy. With that, I think we might be a little bit past our time, but feel free to reach out to me with any questions you might have. Email, Twitter, I can try the phone. If you like the slides, you can just download them directly from the address you see here on the screen. With that, thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks, Kyle. Actually, compared to us starting you a little bit late, I think you gained a little time. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hey, we do have one question. If anybody has any others you want to shoot real quick. When you think about cutting down this list and think about wet chemistry versus NIR, I guess I'm curious your opinion on, would you prefer a wet analysis of fewer ingredients or an NIR on everything? Or can we live, in most cases, just running NIR more frequently on a few key nutrients?
I think that's a really good question, especially as we try to chase more and more of these biological assays, the digestibilities. I think NIR has been a great tool. If you're just looking to manage variation and see how things are changing over time, NIR is definitely the way to go. You get the faster turnaround time, the lower cost. I do think we're pushing the end of what NIR is capable of, at least with the current way instruments are configured and the math we're trying to apply with those NIR calibrations. So we start chasing things that are really dependent on a particle size, like starch and protein digestibility, it might be worth running some chemistry. In a lot of the world, I don't see it being practical to use chemistry because there just aren't chemistry labs. I guess especially if you're going to go down the CNCPS route, no one can afford to wait 3 weeks for a NDF digestibility at 240 hours, right? So in some ways, the models we choose are going to make that decision for us, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does.